March 31st, 2004. Four Blackwater contractors were driving through the hostile streets of Fallujah when their convoy was ambushed by insurgents. Trapped and outgunned, the men fought for their lives, but the brutality that followed shocked the world. Their bodies were dragged through the streets, mutilated, and hung from a bridge, an image that ignited outrage across America and triggered one of the deadliest battles of the Iraq War. This is the story of the Blackwater ambush. March 31st, 2004. Two armored SUVs rolled through the dusty streets of Fallujah. Inside the vehicles, the atmosphere was tense. Scott Hevelston, a former Navy SEAL, scanned the horizon from the passenger seat of the lead vehicle. His keen eyes, trained from years of experience, never stopped moving. Beside him, behind the wheel, was Wesley Battalona, a calm and steady presence who had seen combat in more places than he could count. In the trailing SUV, Jerry Zovko, an Army Ranger with a Croatian accent that hadn't softened despite years in the US, kept a tight grip on his rifle. He exchanged a quick glance with Michael Teague, a quiet and reflective man who had been through his share of hell in the Army. They all knew the risks of the mission. Fallujah was one of the most dangerous cities in Iraq and a stronghold of insurgent activity. Their job was clear: secure the convoy and ensure it made it safely to the US base on the other side of the city. As they entered the outskirts of Fallujah, the streets grew narrower, the buildings more run down. Market stalls lined the roads, where vendors hawked their goods to a sparse crowd of civilians. Most of the locals avoided eye contact with Americans, their faces expressionless, but Hevelston couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The convoy slowed as they navigated a particularly tight street, hemmed in by buildings on either side. The walls were close enough to be touched from the vehicles, and a sense of claustrophobia was palatable. "Stay sharp," Hevelston muttered into his radio. "This could not be a choke point," he said. No sooner had the words left his mouth, a loud crack split the air. A burst of gunfire erupted from a nearby rooftop, followed by the unmistakable sound of a grenade explosion. The lead SUV rocked violently as the grenade detonated just in front of it, sending a shower of debris into the windshield. "Ambush," Battalona shouted, slamming his foot on the gas, but the SUV lurched forward only a few feet before it came to a grinding halt, its tires shredded by the blast. The second vehicle, Zovko and Teague immediately sprang into action. Zovko threw open the door and returned fire immediately. Teague, taking cover behind the door, scanned for targets. The streets had erupted into chaos, with insurgents appearing from doorways and alleyways, their AK-47s barking out bullets. The few civilians who had been on the streets scattered into a panic. Hevelston knew they were in a kill zone. The insurgents had the high ground, and the element of surprise. Staying in the vehicle was suicide. He grabbed his rifle and yelled at Battalona to follow him. They kicked open their doors and sprinted towards the nearest cover, a crumbling wall that offered a sliver of protection. "Fall back to the second vehicle," Hevelston shouted into his radio, trying to coordinate with Zovko and Teague. But the din of the firefight was overwhelming, and it was impossible to tell if his message has been received. Zovko and Teague were pinned down, their vehicles taking heavy fire. Bullets ricocheted off the armor, but the insurgents were getting closer. Zovko fired in short bursts, trying to keep the attackers at bay, but there were just too many. He saw one of the insurgents pull out an RPG. He didn't have time to shout a warning before the rockets streaked towards them. The explosions were deafening. The second SUV was engulfed in flames, and the force of the blast knocked both Zovko and Teague off their feet. Dazed and bleeding, Zovko tried to push himself up, but his body wouldn't respond. He could see Teague lying nearby, motionless. Havelston and Badalona, from their positions behind the wall, watched in horror as the RPG hit the second vehicle, and it was a burning wreck. The streets filled with insurgents. There was no way out. Havelston yelled, "We have to move," but Badalona was already down, hit by a sniper's bullet. Havelston was alone now, and he knew it was only a matter of time till they found him. He fired his rifle until it clicked empty, then drew his sidearm, determined to go down fighting, but the insurgents were on him before he could even reload. They swarmed him, and he felt the first blow land, sharp pain at the back of his head, then another, and another. As his vision dimmed, the last thing Scott Havelston saw was the face of his enemy, twisted in rage as the insurgents pulled him to the ground. The sun was beginning to set over the city. The streets were quiet again, but the aftermath of the ambush was all too evident. The bodies of the 4 Blackwater contractors were dragged through the streets by a jeering mob. The insurgents took perverse pleasure in their victory, venting their hatred on the lifeless forms. At the old bridge over the Euphrates, the mob reached its final destination. There, in a display meant to send a message to the world, the bodies were hung from the bridge, set ablaze, and left to dangle as trophies. The image of the burning bridge, the silhouettes of the contractors suspended, broadcasted worldwide, shocking a global audience, galvanizing U.S. forces into action. But for the people of Fallujah, it was only the beginning. The city would soon feel the full weight of the American military in the First Battle of Fallujah, a brutal and bloody campaign that would turn the streets into a war zone once again. The Blackwater ambush was a tragic and gruesome episode in the Iraq War, one that highlighted the dangers faced by private military contractors and the volatility of the conflicts in Iraq. The deaths of Scott Havelston, Wesley Badalona, Jericho Zovko, and Michael Teague were a grim reminder of the price of war, and their sacrifices would not be forgotten.